Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be on the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is one of the three books of which are attributed, the authorship is attributed to Solomon, who was a king in United Monarchy. The chronological orders in the book in which he writ are not the order in which they're arranged in the Old Testament. Chronologically speaking, he wrote the Song of Solomon, in reflective of his youthful years. The Book of Proverbs was his middle years, and Ecclesiastes represent his mature reflections in the final years of life. And it belongs to the genre of Old Testament wisdom literature, and wisdom, by its very nature, questions things. This makes it different or distinct from the other two genres of Old Testament prophecy and law, and that it's more ask-oriented than answer-oriented. So there's a lot of perplexities in life, and in that sense, it's a lot more challenging and less comforting than the other two genres. And in the Book of Proverbs, he expounds upon the usefulness of wisdom. But in the book of Ecclesiastes, we finally find him questioning the very usefulness of wisdom. What does it all mean? What has it gained him in his final years of life? So it's a really interesting reflection, and we're going to begin with verse 1, the words of Quoleth, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Quoleth translates into preacher. Now, a lot of scholars are inclined to interpret this book in a sermonic tone, but I think the more appropriate emphasis is that of an internal monologue. It's the Song of Solomon is a dialogue between lovers. It's an exchange of essentially expressions of love between one of his early beloved brides, and the Book of Proverbs are also in a monologue tone. The Book of Job is an example of a narrative in Old Testament wisdom literature, which is mostly arranged in dialogues. But this we find, we don't really find character interactions. The dialogue appears to be between one person's mind. He's essentially speaking to himself and expressing himself to posterity, or to anyone who will listen. And vanity, vanity, says the Quoleth, her preacher. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. That expression repeats itself throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. It essentially amounts to his sense of frustration with his life at this point, because he had everything you could ever imagine or ask for, between wisdom, women, power, wealth. He had it all. He was the unique recipient, uniquely receptive of divine grace, but he's beginning to question it all, essentially. And in the next few passages, he preempts by about 400 years what would become known as the pre-Socratic philosophers. The intellectual discipline of philosophy did not come to be known as such until Plato coined the term. But there was pre-Socratics, evidently, who contributed to the body of the academic discipline of what would be known as philosophy. And it wasn't, the Greeks were certainly unique in their contribution to the formation of philosophy as a distinct academic discipline, but the Hebrews were also noted for their wisdom. And one of the most significant debates of the pre-Socratics was the metaphysical nature of the world. And there was one, I believe, Heraclitus was his name, who argued that change was the essential nature of the world. And Parmenides argued that permanence defined the world. And Plato, the great synthesizer, who is the first philosopher to whom we have any record of his thoughts, was the great synthesizer. He essentially synthesized these lessons, but we see a lot of the same synthesis, albeit from a different emphasis. the details are somewhat irrelevant at this point. But we find Solomon saying, "A generation passes away and a generation comes, but the earth stands forever." We see the dynamic of change followed by permanence. The sun also rises and the sun goes and hurries back to the place where it arose, a pattern of change within the parameters of permanence. Going to the south and turning round to the north, turning, and on its round, the wind returns. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea never overflows. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. All matters are wearisome, no one is able to speak of it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the air filled with hearing. This is essentially his frustration with essentially his discoveries. We read in 1 Kings, the close of the 4th chapter, he was a polymath of some distinction, a zoologist, so he wasn't limited to philosophy alone. And there was no word which translates as philosophy or theology in the Hebrew language. Those are terms rooted in Greek terms, but they contributed to what would later be known as those academic disciplines. And for example, the ancient Egyptians were a highly religious people, yet they don't have a word which translates into our word of religion, even though they were highly religious, just for an example. But that's somewhat of a footnote to what should be communicated. What has been said is what shall be. What has been done is what shall be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. So again, we see the pattern of basically for all the change, there's nothing new about it. It's really a repetitive cycle. So the repetition within the cycle, the dynamics are defined by change, but within the wider parameters of that is essentially an aspect of permanence. Is there a matter of which it is said, "See, this is new. It was here already long ago"? There is no remembrance of former ones, nor is there any remembrance of those who are to come, by those who are to come later on. And this is a curious statement because the doctrine of the resurrection is obscure or ambiguous at best in the Old Testament. There are some allusions to it, certainly, one of which is provided by his father David in the 16th Psalm, we see an example of. But Quoleth, or Solomon, the preacher, writes as if the resurrection doesn't exist, as if this earth is a passing show, and he's mindful of his own mortality, basically, and he's writing for posterity, maybe in the hopes of benefiting the posterity that comes after him, or immortalizing himself through the written pen without any concept of an immortal soul or resurrection, essentially. So it's quite curious reconciling this discrepancy in light of his father's apparent knowledge of the doctrine as expressed in the 16th Psalm. There are other Old Testament allusions, Daniel and Job among them, but that's not exactly entirely to the point. Quoleth was king in Israel in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital of Israel, established by David, who drove out the Jebusites, which were the indigenous inhabitants. And Solomon ascended to the throne, and he's unique in that he's also identifying himself as a preacher, which isn't a typical role that kings traditionally perform. They're secular authorities, but here he's laying down spiritually and theologically valid principles. And I applied my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that has been done under the heavens. This evil task Elohim has given to the sons of man, to be humbled by it. So he's essentially amounting that there was the curiosity is as unlimited as our capacities or faculties are limited in comprehending that which we want to know about. and that wisdom is ultimately a humbling endeavor. The more this is Socrates, when he was a little side story here, he was once questioned by the oracles of Delphi, who were recognized religious authorities in Athens. That said that he was the wisest man who ever lived, and he set out to test the veracity of this statement. He interviewed statesmen and poets who all had knowledge respected for their crafts. But Socrates was famous for claiming that he didn't know. The one thing he did know is that he knew nothing. He was infamous in exposing the fallacies of other people's wisdom while offering no answer himself. And this is commensurate with what we find in the writings of Solomon and in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 8:2, which essentially is theological affirmation of the philosophical precept known as Socratic ignorance. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and see, all was vanity and feeding on wind. The crooked could not be straightened, and what is lacking could not be counted. So I spoke to my heart, saying, See, I have attained greatness, and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. And my heart has seen much wisdom and knowledge. So that's really not an understatement. There's a statement by a baseball player whose name escapes me, who is a famous, what other people call the braggart. He famously quipped that there's no such thing as bragging. You're either lying or telling the truth. So Solomon's not speaking with understatement when he says he had unprecedented wisdom. Now, the source of this wisdom was, to some extent, the result of his independent efforts as indicated in the text, but ultimately the source of it was divine grace. The interactions of which we read in the first book of 1 Kings, the 3rd chapter, in which he's visited by Elohim in a dream, who grants him one request, and he, being a 19-year-old ruler, perplexed by the task of ruling so great a people and the covenant people who belong to the Almighty Maker of heaven and earth at that, asked for the wisdom to do this, and he was so pleased with his answer that he also granted him that for which he did not ask, which was wealth and prosperity. But there was also a conditional promise that he would give him long life inasmuch as he remains faithful. And at this point of Solomon's life, we read at the age of 59 years he expired. By that point, he had 700 wives, 300 concubines, in direct violation of the warnings contained in the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy for the excesses that could potentially be entailed by succumbing to kingship. Was that the pagan influence from whom Israel was commanded to be separated from could somehow infiltrate them through political alliances. And a lot of the Old Testament is the political dynamics are really a struggle of faith, with secular rulers placing their faith in political alliances, with the prophets repeatedly admonishing them to put your faith in Yahweh. That's where it belongs. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I knew that this too was feeding on wind. So he's basically finding an essential equivalence in madness and wisdom, in that an equal meaningless, essentially. It can be summarized too. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases suffering. So this is ultimately the price that one pays in the pursuit of wisdom and in the quest of wisdom. And it's our cross to bear, because the more we understand about the world, the more conscious we are of its suffering, and the more cognizant we maybe are of our powerlessness to change forces which are maybe beyond our control. We can contemplate but not fully comprehend, let alone control. And this ties into the humbling aspect of wisdom, which Solomon was clearly quite humbled by his pursuit of wisdom. And we'll pick up on a later chapter in this at another date. Stay tuned. Thanks, guys.